Welcome back, Cold War 5 listeners. I'm your host, Mike Dupre, and today I have the distinct pleasure to welcome Carol Rollie Flynn to the studio. Ms. Flynn is the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute and a 30-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency, director of the CIA's Leadership Academy, director of the Office of Foreign Intelligence Relations, associate deputy director of the National Counterterrorism Center, executive director of the CIA's Counterterrorism Center, and the chief of station in many major postings in Southeast Asia and Latin America. So as we can see, she has very extensive overseas experience in intelligence operations, security, as well as counterintelligence. Aside from these experiences, Ms. Flynn is also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and Security Studies program, where she has co-directed the National Security Critical Issue Task Force, which conducted research on Lone Wolf Terrorism, countering violent extremism, and insider threats. She has also taught at the Fordham University Graduate School of Business and serves as an adjunct staff at the RAND Corporation. Ms. Flynn is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So with that, thank you, Ms. Flynn, for joining me today. It's a real privilege to have you.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
I guess if we jump right back into the questions here, we've talked at great length in some of our conversations at the FPRI about the role of the intelligence in the information age. And to give a bit of a cliche example, I think there's no better messaging to how that's changed than some of the instruments that you brought up, whether it's messages in the shoelaces or microfilm readers. I think intelligence has really evolved in the last 100 years, and I imagine this is something that you've experienced during your career as well. So maybe why is it important that intelligence is evolving?
Well, I think it is really important. I mean, some of the basics are always there. You're basically trying to find out information that is secret, that is timely, and it's information that our policymakers need to make decisions, to plan, to avoid surprise, tactical and strategic surprise. So intelligence, that need for that special kind of information that is not obvious or readily out there, will always be a requirement of our policymakers. What has really changed a lot, or I won't say changed a lot, but has evolved over time, are the methods through which we get that intelligence. And the reason it has to evolve is because we have to stay ahead of our adversaries. And the technology age and the internet has changed the nature of intelligence, the way it comes to us in many different ways. For instance, with the internet, there is so much information out there. Whereas in the past, for instance, the Soviet Union, the Politburo was a big mystery, and there was very little information. Now there's a great deal of information on all manner of topics. So now the challenge is to make sense of that information. For instance, when our security services, the FBI, or working with foreign partners, we have an arrest of, say, an ISIS operative, or even a source brings us a thumb drive full of information. There are terabytes of information in that. And how do you make sense of that? How do you separate the wheat from the chaff? And these technical tools have given us ability to do that. Another, in terms, I've been talking mostly about offensive intelligence, where we're gathering intelligence. But in terms of defensive intelligence, defending what we do, in the old days, we didn't have to worry about biometrics if we crossed a border. It was possible to travel in alias much more easily than it is today, to run undercover street operations. Now, when you do that, there are cameras all around. A lot of them are they're traffic cameras, or they're police security cameras. But you are quite likely, and with facial recognition, it's harder to avoid those kinds of things. So both in offensive and defensive intelligence, technology has been a game changer. That doesn't mean the old methods go away. I still say there is nothing like a personal meeting with a source to give you insight that you can't get through the technology. You can have the best SIGINT collection in the world, you can have the best satellites, but without a human source to tell you, oh, the president was lying when he said that, or those, what you see from the sky is not what you're really seeing. That's a deceptive cover of what's underneath all that. So you will always still need, I believe, a human source.
And maybe as a follow-up to that, you've held a number of executive positions where you're implementing these strategies in very concrete ways. Can you maybe lend any examples or experiences that you've had in which evolution may have aided the mission, or maybe you've found that, like other professions, some intelligence officers can be stuck in their ways and prefer the old school methodology? I don't want to put you on the spot. I know you have.
Well, when I was executive director of the Counterterrorism Center, that was we had a mission that involved basically following terrorists around the world and collecting information about them. And again, as I said, working with the FBI and foreign intelligence and security services to arrest. And when you make arrests, you usually gather a great deal of data. You gather computers, you gather their thumb drives and their cell phones, and that's where technology really plays an important role in making sense of all that data. And that's something that has evolved greatly since the 90s, our ability to make sense of that kind of data. Also, if you have sources reporting on, you have what the CIA does is what we call multi-source analysis, which takes information from all the other government agencies, whether it be the Department of Defense, State Department, maybe even Commerce, Treasury, all the information they collect, as well as everything that's out there openly on the internet. And so, for instance, in the hunt for Osama bin Laden, we were using technical tools to make sense of all that data to try to figure out, again, needle in a haystack, to try to figure out where he might have gone, where people who were around him, where they were traveling, where they were going, that the technical tools we now have enable us to make sense of big data.
On that multi-sourcing topic, this is a conversation I've had with a lot of diplomats or foreign service officers, maybe on the State Department side of things. But they've also echoed the sense that the intelligence community or the larger federal government, the information sharing between agencies is so important, especially today when it's so readily available. Do you think that the information age has made it easier for such sharing to occur? Or do you think in many ways it has muddled the pot of what you're seeing, where maybe there's more contradictions, maybe there's more misleading facts? I'm curious what that dichotomy is kind of like.
Well, I think it has made sharing easier. It has made sharing easier because it now can be done electronically. It's not a perfect system, however. It depends on how you set up those particular correspondence or the cables you write. You want to make sure you get all the addressees who need to see it. There's also a flip side to that. Post 9/11, the IRTPA legislation, the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act, I think it is, of 2004, embraced this concept of need to share. It used to be need to know, and now it was changed to need to share. And yes, sharing is very important. And of course, post 9/11, everyone was talking about the need to connect the dots. The feeling being that there were in disparate areas little kernels of information about the coming attacks on 9/11 that, had they been put together and brought together and analyzed, we would have known that this was going to happen and could have prevented it. I'm not sure that's entirely true, but it was the thought at the time. And so, to try to prevent that, and I thought it was a good idea to try to prevent that. There was a much greater attempt, and in fact, the creation of the National Counterterrorism Center, NCTC, in part to bring together all the agencies across government, not just the intelligence community, to be at the table. I mean, it's all that reporting. The Energy Department might have some, transportation is in there, FAA because of all the flights, the FBI, of course, the CIA, DIA, and the Department of Defense, Treasury because they watch money. So across the government, it's NCTC, National Counterterrorism Center, is a whole of government effort. And this was, again, in part because there was a desire to make sure that 9/11 didn't happen again because we had wouldn't happen when in fact we had the information, but had we analyzed it and brought it together and put it in the hands of people who could do something about it, we didn't want the accident to happen. Now, the downside to that, and I think we've had a very cogent example of the downside of that in Jack Teixeira, the recently arrested individual who was, as we all know now, in a chat group and posting very sensitive information, secret information from primarily military information. But when you share widely, and there's a needle in the haystack again, that one individual or that one accident, the leak, it's not always an individual. Sometimes it's inadvertent that information gets leaked. And when you've got that much information out there and that many individuals touching it, it's almost an actuarial certainty that you're going to have a leak or a bad apple in there who is going to share that information inappropriately.
Of course. I want to talk a little bit about some of your other experience too that's maybe less on the counterterrorism side and more so on the educational side, if you will. This has of course been in several capacities, as the director of the CIA's Leadership Academy. One of your jobs was essentially to oversee the implementation, the development of these new agency leaders and new agency leadership tactics. So I suppose the question I have is a bit more theoretical, maybe even personal, but I'm curious how someone who's essentially trained this group of leaders, how new leadership is kind of adapting to the problems maybe differently than previous classes of leaders. Or is it a balance of the tried and true method, and maybe you think the CIAs in EIC are heading in a new direction with those old methodologies?
It's an interesting question because unlike the military, which has for decades has had a very well developed leadership training program for its cadre of personnel, particularly its officers, and you need look no further than our service academies, West Point, Annapolis, and others, and the war colleges that the military has always embraced, or for much of its history has embraced leadership training. The CIA, not so much. The CIA is very lean and mean. We're so lean that if an officer is pulled off to do training, it means there's a gap. so that was in part why, and I think starting about the 1980s, there grew about a change in thinking. And that was that our officers do need leadership. That leadership isn't, yes, some people are born leaders, but leadership can be taught. And people can learn leadership techniques and self-awareness necessary to be a good leader. And so there was a real change. And I'm not sure technology has really changed sort of the basics of leadership. It's still self-awareness, how to develop trust in the workplace, how to think strategically, how to motivate the people who work for you, how to be a leader at every level, regardless of whether you have a big title or not. Our philosophy was always everyone could be a leader, regardless of your position or your rank. So I think the CIA has very much embraced that really since about the 1980s when our leadership training started. And again, I think the only thing that technology has really changed about that is the availability of that training. When you have a workforce, much of which is posted overseas, technology has enabled us to do online training, something that was not possible, in the earlier decades. So again, the leadership principles, I think, stay pretty much the same, but the methods by which that training gets delivered, I think, have adapted.
And I'm fascinated myself, student, young person, maybe hopeful participant in intelligence, national security, is the availability of open source intelligence and basically how it's revolutionized the availability of information. Stanford scholar Amy Zegart examines this proliferation of such modes of intelligence, and she essentially comes to this conclusion that simultaneously intelligence agencies have to balance the advantages, disadvantages of new technologies like we talked about, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, social media. They're making the offerings of gathering intelligence a lot brighter. Do you think intelligence more transparent will have a positive or negative impact on the quality of reconnaissance? I know that the sheer scale of it will increase, but I'm curious if there's a gray area in there, or if maybe it's yet to be determined on the importance of OSINT.
I think OSINT, open source intelligence, is really, really important. And again, the biggest problems with open source intelligence are how to analyze all that data, how to make sense of all that data, and then how to get that data in the hands of the people who can use that data. And that's sometimes where things break down too. You've got a wonderful intelligence product ready to go, some very important information. It's making sure it gets in the hands of the person who really needs it. And sometimes this can be complicated. For instance, terrorism is a good example where you might have some very sensitive information from a very sensitive source who is, say, a member of a terrorist organization who is very close to the leader of that organization, maybe a senior aide or something, gives you information. Just the existence of that information out there, if it gets out there, could potentially identify a source if he or she is only one of a handful of people who know that information. So that's kind of dangerous for your sources. But yet sometimes it's information that really has to get out there. So you get it out there. One of the issues with making how we do intelligence a little more transparent is that aids your adversaries and they can play with you. Disinformation, denial, and deception techniques have been around for, the Trojan horse as an example of a deception operation. So the more that's out there and the more that your techniques are transparent, the more opportunity the adversary has to game you and anticipate what you're going to do and to play with you. I do think, however, we are not Russia. We are not North Korea. We are not an autocratic state. We have a contract with the American people. And so I think it is important, just by the nature of who we are and what our country is, that the citizens have an opportunity to understand, at least at a big level, what the intelligence community does and why they do it. Now, we have kind of a love-hate affair in the United States with intelligence, and it's cyclical depending on how threatened the American public feels. If you took a poll on September 12th, 2001, of what kind of techniques the CIA should be using, you would get a very different answer. I imagine everybody was willing to give up a little bit of their freedom. People were willing to endorse techniques that maybe today we wouldn't, accept necessarily. But again, when threatened, the American people, it's cyclical. And I think today, perhaps the cycle has sort of turned again a little bit more favorably toward intelligence, given what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. So again, it's something we do have to be very careful about to make sure, are we consistent? Are we operating in a manner that's consistent with our republic, with our Constitution? And just an anecdote, I was overseas for years. And when I came back from overseas after the Iran Gate, remember the trading arms for hostages, that whole fiasco in the mid 80s, one of the biggest changes I noticed, and I'd been away for a few years before I went back to headquarters, was there a bunch of lawyers at headquarters, again, to make sure that we were operating within law. So ultimately a good thing. So again, transparency, you can't tell them everything. If you give away your sources go away or get thrown in the slammer in some foreign prisons, executed in cases. So you got to figure out where that line is, what you let the public know. This is also what you let, one of the differences in the United States from a lot of countries around the world is that we have congressional oversight. And judicial oversight over what we do. And so we are required to notify Congress on a regular basis. They approve, appropriate, and authorize our budget. So it's very important that we keep a select group within the Congress advised of how we do what we do and what we're up to. And those are the oversight committees: the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, as well as the House Appropriations Committee and the Senate Appropriations Committee. They need to know what we're doing. At least we don't tell them our sources, but they know in general terms what we're doing, or if we have any kind of a new initiative or a covert action. And we don't have time today to talk about covert action, but those require a finding signed by the president, notification to Congress. Again, not to everyone in Congress, but to those select committees. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, no, definitely. That was great. I got a little overview on kind of how you guys do what you, well, why you guys are allowed to do what you do, essentially.
It all has to be constitutional.
Exactly, of course.
And there's also, if you were drawing a Venn diagram, you might say, one circle would be what is legal, and the other circle going in there, what is effective. And so there's a lot that's legal and effective. But then you also have another circle which is what is consistent with the values of the American people, which makes it even smaller what we can do. But that one circle changes over time, what American values are at a particular time.
It's interesting that dynamic between you guys as an executive group, but also that interesting overlap that needs to be there, and maybe in a democratic society, but I think maybe more importantly or more pertinent to the United States. That brings up my next question, which is essentially telling people that you don't want to tell, but you have to tell what is going on. I've never done a government briefing. I imagine you've done millions in your day, but government briefings, from what government briefings are, I guess maybe TV portrays them as concise, catchy, no margin for error, and certainly not overdone with verbiage. Simplicity and speed are key. Does OSINT, or you trying to navigate your way around covert operation or something like that, does that complicate it? How has that changed as your career has progressed and the access to information has become greater?
Yeah. Well, we certainly have. There's a lot more out there about what we do. So in terms of congressional oversight, it's quite likely that our congressional overseers and the staffers who staff those committees are going to know about stuff because they're going to see it in the paper, and we get queries. I still say we. I'm sorry if you open my heart. I'm, CIA still after 30 years, but I no longer work there. Now there's so much more out there that you get a lot of questions for the record, even on what this is about, and then you have to respond to those. One of the big issues, of course, is need to know. And in some cases, you will not brief the entire committee. You'll brief the committee chair and senior member if it's something so sensitive, and particularly if it's something in advance of something that's going to happen. The Osama bin Laden raid is an example I can think of, or something on that scale that is going to go down, and you don't want the whole committee to know, but you do want to give a heads up to the senior leadership. So there are cases like that. The other big difference is, when you watch these things on TV, these congressional testimony, you might note that in real life we're not all that pretty. Someone once said Washington is Hollywood for ugly people. And so anyway, yeah, a lot of the testimony is long and boring. Well, I guess if you're interested in the topic, it's interesting. But again, there is a desire to make sure that it's not packaged so neatly and in a flashy way, that we make sure we are conveying the information that the Congress needs to know. A lot of care is taken to the preparation of those briefings for Congress. But there are also more informal meetings with staffers and with members, including out in the field when congressional delegations travel. Those who have oversight responsibilities will meet much more informally, the CIA out in the field.
The availability of information and intelligence has expanded beyond the scope of the IC. I think an example of that might be Russia's invasion of Ukraine, how researchers at the Middlebury Institute essentially used Google Maps to track traffic jams in Russia, which led to the Ukrainian border, and to which Dr. Jeffrey Lewis, he's obviously a famous OSINT reporter, tweets out someone's on the move, and within the hour, Russian troops have begun their invasion. This is obviously conducted with publicly available information, credence obviously given to their expertise in this, or do you suspect that this trend will continue, and maybe do you think because of it, militaries and governments can play a more proactive role in stopping or mitigating threats before they happen?
It's a really interesting trend, and it's the trend for the future. Technology has sort of democratized intelligence collection. I just think it's part of the landscape now, and you just have to accept it. It's interesting because it does also give you an opportunity to use that information more than you could say in the past, when it was a very secret collection platform that you couldn't tell anybody that you had eyes on the ground. Nowadays, it's out there, so you don't have to be so careful. And I think, during the run up to the Russian invasion, the US government very much used the intelligence they knew to try to preempt Putin and the Russians, or at least put them on balance. For instance, there was clearly a deception going on that they were trying to pin on the Ukrainians. Our government called them on it. I think put them a little bit off balance. That said, there was all that information out there, and I'm told that, in the days before the invasion, most of Ukraine, the citizenship, didn't believe that attack was nobody was making preparations to leave town, or very few. You can have all that information out there. And this is another truism of intelligence. People always scream about intelligence failure when something goes wrong, when in fact, in many cases, the intelligence was in the hands of the policymakers, but they didn't act on it. And again, I don't blame them, because the intelligence is never 100% guaranteed. It's again what we hear. And how often does somebody tell you something that plans change? Intelligence is never static. It changes, and it's highly dependent on the source where you're getting it from and their particular access on that day. And leaders change their minds. They also lie. So, it's problematic.
You've mentioned this. No intelligence is 100%. In fact, the experts over at NATO actually calculated, I think it was not higher than 5% was what NATO had collectively expected the likelihood of invasion to be, which is, I don't know by intelligence standards if that's at all high or low, but I think most people are.
I'm not sure how they got that information. I would sort of say, were they in the cabinet rooms of everyone in NATO?
Exactly. But I mean, most of the people that were sounding the alarms were people in academia or maybe military historians, people who kind of knew the ethnic trends there. But in hindsight of all of this,
the U.S. knew.
No, exactly.
We made that very clear.
I know. And it was one of the interesting revelations was the U.S. taking the front on that and being like, hey, we should probably do something here. But I think a lot of the people, in hindsight, intelligence can be preventative in what they attempting to do, but policymakers, of course, have to do the heavy lifting of getting people on board.
I was just going to say, you also want to be very careful in not being the boy who cried wolf, because if you do it too many times, too many warnings, and it doesn't happen, people start not to take you seriously as well. When the intelligence community puts out an intelligence report, and an individual intelligence report, not the finished analysis, but if we put out a report, one of the important aspects of any report is the sourcing. There is a source line on every intelligence report that basically obliquely describes the source without giving the source's name or exact position. But it addresses their credibility and their track record. And if it's, a volunteer, that source line will say this is a volunteer with no track record and no record of credibility. But anyway, so you do attempt to put what you're sending out in a context, which will enable the reader and the policymaker to read it and say, And the other thing about that is you will want to look at, is that person's information corroborated elsewhere? Corroboration. That's how you then, a source, as you try to evaluate a source over time, you look at, has the information proved to be correct? Has it been corroborated? And then at a certain point, you might change that source description and keep modifying it, again, to try to aid the policymaker in weighing the veracity of that information. You can't sit on it. You can't sit on information, particularly if it's threat information. You got to put it out there, even if you don't necessarily know the credibility of that information.
That harkens to the point of the policymakers have to make that decision as well, what they are willing to share and what they're willing to advocate for. So I guess continuing on that theme of NATO, and in my opinion, the international organizations kind of the greatest diplomatic potential. But the body's expanding. New admittances have pushed around the organizational makeup. I think they're now beyond their 30 member state mark officially, I think now, by the time of this interview. So I think it also begs the question, if the United States or one of its allies gets intelligence, what's the rationale behind determining who we share such intelligence with?
Yeah, that's a complicated question, because the minute you share intelligence, you no longer control it. And whoever you're sharing it with can share it with others. So you want to weigh every time you share information. We, of course, have the Five Eyes, the five English-speaking democracies that we have our closest intelligence relationship with. That's, the UK, Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. So there's a great deal of sharing that goes on with the Five Eyes. The other NATO partners, also very close relationships. However, again, and this applies to Five Eyes too, you won't necessarily share every single thing with your intelligence partners. And a lot of that has to do, you look and say, if country Y might be a good ally of yours, but they have a very robust trade relationship with North Korea. You want to say, on this particular piece of information, do we really want to share it with them if there is some possibility that might go to North Korea? Again, that's sort of an extreme example, but you do want to look at that. And then you also want to look at how much are they sharing with us? What are they doing for us? And selectively, you may share information with a particular country on a particular topic, but not on all topics. I don't know. I don't want to give a specific country, but you don't necessarily want to share with country X something about country Y, who's an ally of theirs, because it might be A, source revealing, or B, you have to think about how is that country going to use that information. Example, if you have two countries who are at war with each other and you give a piece of information to one, they might use it to attack the other. And you want to and sometimes we have countries that are at war with each other and both countries are allies of ours. So, it gets very complex how you do that. And you do want to be very, very careful.
I'd like to take this chance to plug the FPRI for a moment. The Foreign Policy Research Institute is dedicated to producing the highest quality of scholarship and nonpartisan policy analysis, focusing on crucial foreign policy and national security challenges facing the United States. We seek to educate those who make and influence policy, but also engage with the general public at large through the lens of history, geography, and of course, culture. I've had the great opportunity to work with Ms. Flynn this past semester and continuing on into the summer, and it's an opportunity that I've been very grateful to have. But the FPRI has a number of other scholars who are also doing very interesting research. Some might include former World Bank President Robert Zoellick, who recently published a book, America in the World, A History of U.S. Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. Other notable people are the Long-Term Strategy Group President and CEO, Jacqueline Deal, the distinguished Kissinger professor, Dr. Hal Brands, who's written a number of notable books in recent years, as well as the Financial Times Business Book of the Year author, Chris Miller, who is currently over at the Tufts Fletcher School of Diplomacy. With that said, I'd like to bring us back to our regularly scheduled program. I think, as you've mentioned, the Five Eyes, as it compromises Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, as well as the United States, I think a notable omission to this list is France and the Directorate General for External Security. Obviously, they've preferred to remain sovereign and have a very robust network of operations on their own. And I'm sure in many respects we do share intelligence with them. But President Emmanuel Macron has recently said that he wants Europe to take a different approach to China's rise than the United States has historically and is taking right now. And I'm presuming that a lot of the other, maybe that's an overassumption, a lot of the other European Union states might follow that rhetoric that Macron's essentially laying out. So given the emergence of China and their Ministry of State Security, I don't think that the Five Eyes in jeopardy. Maybe you can lend some insight into that, but I'm curious, is the Five Eyes malleable enough to weather that storm where, you're seeing growing relations and maybe relations that are not or different from the perspective of the United States?
They'll always be different from the United States. There's an old line that countries don't have friends, they have interests. and alliances are based on mutual interest. I don't see the Five Eyes going away anytime soon. And I'm thinking decades out there. I think the Five Eyes will still be there. We have a shared language, we have shared values, and we differ on some things, but on the big stuff, we are completely in sync, I believe. France, good example. France is one of our oldest allies. They were with us at the Revolutionary War. If it weren't for France, we might still be a member of the British Commonwealth. So France is a very, very close ally. Those countries that are members of NATO and aren't necessarily members of the Five Eyes, we still have very, very close relationships with them. We can't do what we do without those partners because it's the information sharing isn't one way. They share with us too. They also carry our water in parts of the world where we can't go, and help us. And as you know, we have interest sections in other embassies in places where we don't have diplomatic representation, and vice versa. We help other countries in places where they don't have a presence, and sometimes it's because of political reasons they can't be in a country, but more often it's because they don't have the resources to have an embassy or a consulate in every part of the world. So we look after their interests in many places in the world.
If we want to stay on that topic of China, the emergence of the Ministry of State Security, I think it's been a very interesting trend that maybe differs from some Western intelligence organizations. You were recently featured on a CNN interview where you essentially discussed these tactics that they're employing, which are maybe different, maybe similar. I don't want to give too much away about what we do, but I assume the phrase that you use adequately points to what you think that the Chinese are doing, which has been very effective for them, which is quote unquote hunting in the diaspora of Chinese nationals that don't live in China. Obviously, they have an absolutely massive population, many of whom aren't even on the Asian continent. I know here at Boston University and in general the Boston area, this has been a very big topic in recent years with the amount of academia in the area, but by no means is this a trend isolated to this region. Should the United States government and the general public be at all concerned with this tactic? Are there any measures that people are taking kind of just naturally, and maybe what exactly might those measures entail?
The issue is, yes, they hunt in the diaspora. They have for decades, and I think always have. And it's natural because they speak the same language. They, in many cases, there's a shared culture, and in some cases, the ethnic Chinese, have relatives back in China. So in a way, it can be coercive, a form of coercion, like cooperate with us or your relatives have a job. Chinese, by the way, aren't the only people who do this. It's just their numbers are so great. So it happens. But they hunt in the diaspora, but that isn't a reason, to discriminate or not trust, for instance, Chinese Americans. The numbers of, the people they recruit are tiny. It's a handful in a huge diaspora. One of the numbers I've heard thrown around is there's something like 300,000 Chinese students in the United States. And so there is, as well as Chinese citizens doing commerce and professors and all of that. So there's a large, even Chinese citizen diaspora in the United States, as well as Chinese Americans. To assume that their activities of all of them are nefarious would be wrong. And I think we have to, again, in this country, we have a legal framework for how we do intelligence inside the United States. And we are very, very careful about that. And, we have rule of law. We have a Fourth Amendment here. We have a FISA court, Foreign Intelligence Security Act, I think, the FISA court. If something is done in the United States against a foreign entity, surveillance or otherwise, you have to go before a judge and get that approved. So in this country, we have, again, an infrastructure to ensure that whatever we do is done consistently with, American law. And other countries don't necessarily have such a rigorous underpinning of lawful oversight. Russia, for instance, the GRU officers that's military intelligence, the GRU, can go poison Sergei Skripal in the UK. We don't do that. So, and North Korea engaged in those kind of operations as well. Again, I think there are reasons why they do target the diaspora. Almost all Chinese spies are spying on behalf of the government of China against the United States. Almost all of them, not all of them. There are few exceptions, have been ethnic Chinese.
One of the reasons people have remained concerned about China's rise politically, economically. I think in many respects it's an image problem of the United States as this grandiose power as well. And tangentially, some would say that the CIA has also historically had an image problem in the United States as well, which you've mentioned before as well. And so as someone who works within an organization like the CIA, where its image isn't as important as, a politician's image, but where we are in a democratic state and, you do in some respects need the approval of the people. What does it mean for an intelligence agency to operate in an open democratic society? Are there inherent difficulties with that? And how does the United States and the CIA manage those difficulties to, the extent in which they can?
Yeah, I think there are inherent restrictions on what the CIA does simply because we operate under a legal framework, and we have values that are different from the Chinese, the Russians, the North Koreans, and a lot of other countries in the world. Again, are very careful that we operate in accordance with those. And you're absolutely right that the CIA, I think at its inception, post World War II, first of all, what the CIA did was little known. And I think if you ask the average American, well, this is still true. They wouldn't know exactly what the CIA does, but certainly in the 50s, I think there was a more positive view about the CIA. That changed in the, I think with the rise with the Vietnam War, which changed, I think, not just American views about the CIA, but American views about government in general and our institutions in the United States. The trust in institutions, polls have shown that it has gone down pretty much across the board. A CIA in the 1970s, mid 1970s, there were the Frank Church was a member of Congress, and the church committee hearings went on day after day after day. The CIA director at the time, William Colby, the CIA director at the time, William Colby, went down to the Hill day after day and basically briefed the Congress in open hearings. A lot of these were open hearings, but on the operations of the CIA, and a lot came out during that time. And I think a lot of Americans were shocked. And there were some of the operations that didn't really show well with a light shined on them. And some of those were I'm forgetting the name of the operation, the one where tested LSD on people, and there was a tragedy of one of our officers committing suicide out of an office building window. And and some of the covert actions, which are now have been declassified, maybe not every document, but much of them declassified, such as the Operation Ajax, the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh, who was a democratically elected leader in Iran in 1953. The CIA overthrew a popularly elected leader. And these operations in time have come out and are controversial. A lot of changes happened as a result of those exposures during the 1970s, including the creation of these oversight committees in the Hill to make sure that there was a check on what the CIA was doing. Prior to that, there was really a very close relationship between a handful of senators and congresspersons with the CIA, and there wasn't nearly the sort of detailed briefings in those days to the Hill that exist today.
One of the interesting things that, from my opinion, that I've learned in CIA research was, and this kind of harkens back to these interesting tactics that the CIA has employed, come up with to employ. Innovation is something that that quote, innovation excites, but in some ways not in the best way. One of the ones that I guess got a lot of public disapproval was in 2001, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, DARPA, started researching the methods of applying DARPA's Future Markets Applies to Prediction program, which essentially tested whether prediction markets, so essentially markets in which people could bet on the likelihood of future events, could be used as a way to improve existing strategic approaches. The program was canceled in 2003, but it was largely because of congressional criticism. But the idea was nonetheless interesting in the sense that, if you can't give everyone a security clearance, but statistically people will lean more right than wrong if the sample size is big enough. And this is one of, I'm sure, many proposals that have been thrown out by the Pentagon or by the intelligence community to kind of reinvent new ways to counteract terrorism or various issues that we face. But in an age where the CIA operates a little bit more openly, or at least people are more aware of what the CIA does than maybe what they used to, can you speak to the importance of coming up with such ideas, but making sure, however outlandish it might seem to the American people, should the CIA be thinking more pragmatically in the digital age about what they're willing to throw out there as a potential? Or do you think these more interesting, innovative approaches, if you will, are necessary for the job?
You don't want to cut off creativity and creative approaches, because sometimes novel approaches produce methods and technologies that are worthwhile. And you do want, there's such a thing as groupthink. Groupthink was blamed for the faulty assessment of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So you always want to have, red team kinds of exercises to make sure that you're getting minority viewpoints and people thinking about things in different ways. But that bucks up against budgets. How much money are you going to spend on this? Does it pass kind of the giggle test? And, one of the things we used to say at the CIA when we were proposing an operation, one that might, you never want something at the CIA to reach the light of day. You want to keep it secret, but you always ask yourself, if it does, could it stand scrutiny? And, it's the New York Times or the Washington Post test. If you read it on the front page of the New York Times, you don't want to read it on the New York Times, but could you defend it? And does it make sense to the average American? There's also the mom test. If you told this to your mom, would your mom be okay with this? So that's another test. So yes, I think you always need innovation, and you need new ways to do innovation. You always want to be thinking about that, because you do want to avoid groupthink, and you do want to make sure you're getting an outside sort of novel look at something. And but at the same time, you got to be cognizant that you're spending taxpayers' money, and how would the average taxpayer feel about this? And the American public. It's important.
Maybe this is a plug to the project we're working on, and this is the final question for today. The CIA has aided this transition into the digital age a little bit with the agency's now about 20 years old, venture cap firm, In-Q-Tel, which has sprouted up around the turn of the century, that essentially has played a critical role in bringing private sector technology into the CIA's sphere of influence. Of course, the CIA has more rigorous tests for such software and hardware. And this is a great example of one of the CIA's initiatives where creativity has indeed worked not only for the intelligence community, but also for the general public as well. Some interesting things have been, Palantir has been a great company by which a lot of different private sector firms are using to kind of find creative ways to use data, but also the CIA also had been aided by this advancement. I think another one might be Keyhole, which became Google Maps, things like this. I guess from your perspective, I guess this question is twofold. One, are you optimistic about the future of intelligence and hurdles that such innovation can overcome? And maybe secondly, from your perspective, why is it necessary that the CIA is interacting with the private market? And how is this contributing to the broader innovation ecosystem that we're very fortunate to have in the United States?
Optimistic about the CIA's ability to continue to innovate with the private sector? Yes, I am. I think the nature of government government, and the CIA is probably one of the smaller agencies and in government, and also one of the most nimble. However, that said, it takes a long time to hire people at the CIA because you have to put them through security clearances, and you don't want to hire the wrong person, and bringing them on board is slow. And it's a bureaucracy. So what you do, you have to take to Congress and you get approval for it and get approved and authorized. It's slow. It's again, as I say, CIA is way more nimble than most government entities, but it's still not as fast as the private sector. And we are not in possession of all the good ideas. And so the idea of creating an incubator, In-Q-Tel, in the 1990s, I thought was brilliant, to bring in young, smart entrepreneurs who could think outside of the box, to use a cliche, and come up with solutions to hard problems. And we saw that it worked. For instance, the most famous example is Palantir, which now has a lot of big contracts with the government, but to do data analysis, big data analysis, that and things that the CIA was not able to do on its own. And so I think it's necessary. I think it's necessary. I think it's a great idea. The military has been doing this kind of thing for a long time, and so I thought I do believe that applying this to intelligence is really, really important. And you had a second half of that question. I'm very optimistic, and I think that the biggest hurdles are bringing good people into the intelligence community. Our country needs the best and the brightest to go into public service and to step up and serve. The CIA, careers in the CIA are difficult. I mean, first of all, it's hard to get hired because they scrutinize every aspect of your life just about. And, you got to, make sure you keep your nose clean if you want to work at the CIA. But finding people who have the ethics, who have the brains, who have the sort of personal qualities necessary to work in an intelligence in an intelligence capacity is not easy. And so we need to keep that pipeline of the best and the brightest applying. And I think that is probably our greatest challenge. Although the intelligence community, there's a huge pipeline of people who still want to work in the intelligence community. So that's a good thing. But again, that to me is the critical thing. I also think making sure that we, without giving away secrets and undermining what the intelligence community does, we do have to be able to explain what we do, at least at a high level, to the American people and to our overseers in Congress. I think that is very important.
Thank you, Ms. Flynn, for joining me today. I appreciate you coming in.
Thanks very much.